Hey, thank you for joining us, everyone. It's really great to see you on this special morning as we join with Christians all around the world who are remembering the resurrection of Jesus. It's a significant time. It is every year, and so we're so glad that you're here. I want to start this morning. We're gonna have some more worship at the end today, a little bit more of an extended time than we normally do as we take communion together. But I'd like to start today with some controversial statements that I believe are true. I'm going to give you 4 of them, all right? Toby's ready to go today. All right. He's ready. You've been waiting for that, to yell that out. Your mouth is full. You just had to jump on it. All right. I have 4 controversial statements. These are controversies, but I believe they are true. And if you agree with me, I want you to clap your hands and make a ruckus. If you don't agree with me, just keep it to yourself. All right? So that's how we're going to do this, okay? Okay. So, first of all, statement number 1. The best jelly beans are Starburst jelly beans. Right? Don't you think? Are there some people out there who like those black licorice jelly beans? It's okay. Yeah, you know what? Yeah, they haven't had Starburst jelly beans. That's what those are. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Second statement. The best marshmallow is Peeps marshmallows. Oh, come on. Come on, they're pretty good. Someone told me earlier this week that marshmallow is too broad a category to bring down to Peeps because there's so many different kinds of marshmallows. But when I want to eat a marshmallow, I eat a Peeps marshmallow, all right? Raise your hand if you like Peeps. Oh, my gosh. I don't know. I associate it with childhood. Okay, didn't we have one? Didn't I hear that one time we passed out Peeps here on a set? It must have made everyone angry as they came in. Okay, here's the next one. The best chocolate is a Cadbury egg. I'm trying. It's a controversy. Yeah, that's right. Okay, but then I thought of another one. I was talking to Jeremy about these earlier this week, and he was disagreeing with me on most of them. But then I thought of a new statement that Jeremy, maybe even you will agree with. We'll see. You ready? The best egg is a Cadbury egg. No. I'm trying. All right. Okay. I haven't bought my Cadbury. I buy one Cadbury egg every Easter. I only eat one because otherwise I would just put them down. And they're so sweet, they make me choke a little bit. When I bite into them, I'm like, they get in the back of your throat. Okay. I hope you guys got enough candy and whatnot. My 8-year-old daughter was at a Easter egg hunt at Cascadian yesterday. It's put on by a neighborhood association. I was trying to prepare her that there was going to be a lot of kids and you might only get a few eggs. So I'm like trying to avoid like the emotional meltdown, And it turned out, I don't know, this might not be great for the neighborhood, but there was only about like 15 kids. But it meant she came home with like 200 eggs. So that's what, it's truly Easter for her this year. All right, friends, we're going to look at a passage that may be somewhat familiar to you. It's a story of these disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24. And I am going to read the whole thing. We don't always do that before we get to our Bible study, but I do want to read the whole thing today. The context is that this is after, the gospel writer records this, after Jesus' death and resurrection. But the disciples still have questions. They know that Jesus' body is no longer in the tomb, but Jesus' disciples have not yet widely been able to understand that he's been raised from the dead. So this is one of those appearances of Jesus that came to some disciples. They're walking from Jerusalem to a town called Emmaus that we think is about 6 or 7 miles from Jerusalem. So it was within a day's walk. And they're walking there, and they have an interaction with the risen Christ, which we're going to read about in just a moment. One of the disciples is named in this passage. The other one is not. It's interesting, like church commentators, historians, theologians have often noted that the lack of naming of the second disciple allows us to find ourselves in a very personal way in this story, almost to imagine ourselves as that second disciple. These disciples, as far as we know, are not, 2 of the 12, but probably part of the wider community of disciples that followed Jesus and ministered with him. And this interaction mostly happens on this road to this town, and that's an interesting theme all throughout the scriptures, actually. It's an interesting study to look at the roads that show up, or the paths that show up, or things that happen with people as they're walking. All the way back to Abraham and Isaac walking up to that place where God provided the sacrifice. But then you can think of Paul on the road to Damascus, or the stories that happened on the road to Jericho. This is a theme of discipleship. It's a theme of us journeying with God, journeying with each other, and journeying with Jesus. And this is one of those roads. So the church has long understood this passage to be representative of things that can happen in our own journeys with Jesus, our own discipleship with Jesus. That if we're going to be on this long walk with Jesus, we might expect things to happen with us, like what happened with these disciples on the road to Emmaus. So let's read it together, and then it's our practice to spend some time in Bible study together, just making some observations with those around you. Questions you have, things you notice, things that maybe stirred your heart. And you can share that with each other, and then we'll come back together. So let me read this passage, Luke 24, beginning in verse 13. Now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find the body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Okay, at your tables, go ahead and make some observations to one another, ask some questions, share with one another what you're noticing in the text. Maybe just a couple of minutes more. Okay, let's bring it back together. We have a mic. I wonder if there's just a few people who would be willing to share your observations with the whole group. Either something you observed or something that your table or group observed. Is there anyone who would be willing to share, or a question you have? Right here. I should have brought some jelly beans and Peeps and thrown them out to people. No one would have wanted the Peeps, though, clearly. You would have eaten them if I gave them to you. Okay, go ahead.
I'm anti-jelly beans. No, that's not true. So early on in the passage, when Jesus first joined up with them, they're walking. And then he said, what are you discussing? They stood still. I love that mental picture of them walking. And we've all had those moments when the Holy Spirit speaks to us through something we're reading or a conversation, and we just stopped. All of our attention just rivets to whatever God's doing in that moment. That's what I picture happened to them. They stood still. Then their hearts were ready to hear what Jesus had to say on the road.
Great observation. Yeah, their time on this road and then in this meal with Jesus is a journey from disorientation, from despair, right, to these moments where Jesus begins to interrupt that narrative for them. It's a great observation of one of those times in this passage.
Whatever, bro.
Well, the earth is flat, but
there's all kinds of things being said here today.
What I find interesting is here they are walking, and then Jesus obviously starts walking with them. And it's not until they're at the table where he breaks bread. And it reminds me that we too walk with Jesus today and don't realize that he's walking with us until at some point he reveals to us that he was with us all along.
Mm-hmm. Yes, great observation. There's a reason why this passage has felt so precious to the church for so long, right? In terms of understanding what our walks with Jesus might look and feel like. Up here, Ezra. Thanks.
I mostly have a question. When it says that they were kept from recognizing him in verse 16, were they kept from recognizing them by their own emotional turmoil, or did Jesus keep them from recognizing him?
Yeah, great question, right? But it does seem like something is going on in this passage besides just them not being able to see, right? Like they were kept somehow. We're going to talk about that a little bit, about the role of hiddenness even in God's revelation. It's a great observation. Good question. Maybe one more.
Yeah, we touched on the hiddenness a little bit here at our table, and I thought it was interesting how as he's walking with them, God being all-knowing, he's like asking them questions as if like he doesn't know what was going on. Yeah. And
what happened?
And that kind of makes you think, like, throw back to the garden when the fall happened. He's like, why are you hiding? Who told you you're naked?
Right.
Like, we confess.
Right. Also, the asking of questions is certainly one of the clues that this is Jesus, right? Because this is how Jesus interacted with his own disciples. It's how he interacted with the crowds, was often in asking questions. Very Jewish thing, very rabbinical thing. But it's also the way of Jesus, right, in teaching and in bringing people to the truth. So that's a great observation. All right, friends, for the next few moments, let's consider this passage, like I said, as descriptive of what seasons or portions of our journey with Jesus could look like. That the road to Emmaus is a road that we end up traveling on in one form or another. That the different things that happen on this road are likely true in our own discipleship journey as well. The story begins with these disciples discussing what happened the last few days in Jerusalem. The torture and execution they saw of Jesus, his burial, and then this mystery about his body not being in the tomb anymore. In other words, as they were discussing what happened, what happened was not good to them, right? They're processing their despair. They're processing their disappointment. Now, I think it's good that in this passage we have an example of two disciples actually discussing their disappointment. I think that ought to be a practice for us as well. I think one of the most harmful things we can do, and I think sometimes we're given to this in Christian community, is for us to feel disappointment or to experience it and not talk about it at all, right? Because we feel like it would dishonor faith, or we feel like it would dishonor the truth of Jesus. But here's two disciples mulling it over, talking with one another. I think that's healthy. I think that's good. I think that's what communities of discipleship should look like. That we should have the bravery to be able to talk about disappointment, particularly when it feels like divine disappointment. When it feels like we thought God was going to come through in some kind of way, or that his promise would mean something for us right now, and then it doesn't feel that way at all. Now, for me, this is the hardest when it feels like things were getting better, and then all of a sudden they turned out to be worse. You know what I mean? Have you ever experienced this, like just in your walk with Jesus or in the life of your microchurch or as a missionary as you're walking this out, that it would be one thing if things just stayed bad, you know? And we were just waiting for some future hope. But it's always harder for me when it feels like something was getting better and now it proves to be worse than what we even originally thought. And that's the position these disciples are in. They had actually come to believe in this man named Jesus. They had seen his miracles. They had come to believe that he was the one that the prophets had spoken about. And then in a matter of days, it seems like all of that is completely shattered. Now, I find it interesting that sometimes I think, even though it's subconscious, I know better, but sometimes I think that the way this walk with Jesus is going to play out is that things are just going to somehow get progressively better until all things are made well. But God didn't say that, right? Old Testament and New Testament, prophets and apostles tell us that this age in which we live in, an age called in both testaments as the last days, is a time when not one kingdom is on the earth, but two. A kingdom of light and a kingdom of darkness. And that this in-between time in which we experience our lives is a time in which it will feel like progress is being made towards the redemption of all things, and then times when it feels like casualty and despair. That this is actually the experience that was predicted. This is the experience that we were told about, that this is what this age of human history would feel like. That's how we would experience it. And yet, I can't help but feel the letdown. Every time it seems like things are getting better, and then they get worse. But as was already said, it might be that on this road to Emmaus, when we're talking about our disappointment with one another, that Jesus might just join us in that walk. But it also might be true that we might not recognize him. Think about that just for a moment. That whatever you are experiencing right now is disappointment. Whatever you are experiencing this Easter Sunday as despair, whatever you are experiencing as incomplete or sadness or chaos or death, and the list could go on and on, as sickness, it's possible that right now Jesus is standing with you and me in it, but we cannot recognize him. This story means that that's a possibility. That Jesus could actually be walking on the road with us, but we can't identify him. That we can't see evidence of him. That if you asked me, where is Jesus right now, I might not be able to say, but it doesn't mean that he's not there. That he could be present in it with us. And as our sister pointed out, it's also possible that God himself might somehow be involved in restricting our ability to see. Now, this is something to wrestle with, isn't it? Because we know that God is self-revealing and that he loves to reveal himself, that we wouldn't know who he was if he didn't reveal himself to us, and that His history with humanity is of him revealing himself to us over and over again. So we know that God does this. And yet, we can't ignore this theme in the scriptures too, that sometimes it seems as if God hides himself from us. That hiddenness and revealing are somehow interconnected in how God works with us. Now, that could probably be like a whole message in and of itself, and I don't think we're going to have time to explore all of that today. But I think there, at the very least, there's something about God restricting our sight and then allowing us to see that somehow gives us a moment of consciousness or awareness that changes us in a profound way afterwards. It's like it's accentuated because it's hidden. I was thinking about this because some of you joined us for Tazay on Friday night at the drop. And while we were setting up at the drop, I was talking to Lindsay and John, who were so hospitable and gracious to us so we could use the facility. And I asked Lindsay for a key to the building, and she handed it to me. I put it on my keychain. And then I looked at John and Lindsay and said, "Where did I put my keys?" I was holding them. All right. I said, "Where did I put my keys?" And then they didn't say anything, so they must not have noticed. But then I went off in the building to look for my keys, right? And I said, "Am I the only one that does this kind of thing?" You got I went off to look for my keys, and I spent time looking in every room and all the seats that I'd been on, the whole time with my keys in my hand. And suddenly I realized, boom, there they are, right, in my hand. Now, then I walked out of the building without saying a word to John and Lindsay because I thought if I bring this up, they're just going to laugh at me and make fun of me. And so I just decided to leave and not bring it up to them, right? But think about that. It's possible for something to be present and us not to be conscious of it. Sometimes right in front of our face. But as soon as we're conscious of it, it reinterprets our circumstance, right? As soon as I realized the keys were in my hand, right? It means that I don't have to behave the same way. It means that I don't have to look anymore. Guys, I don't know. I don't understand it all, but it seems to me that this phenomena of hiddenness and then revelation and the aha moment that it causes, somehow that's useful in the way that God works with us and how he transforms our minds and our hearts. It might just be that as we're walking this road to Emmaus and Jesus is with us, even if we can't recognize him, that Jesus might begin to ask us questions. You know, sometimes we're waiting for a word from Jesus, but what if what Jesus has to give is a question? What if he has for us is something that he wants us to wrestle with? He asks two questions of these disciples, as we already noted. He asks them, what they're talking about and then what happened. He's drawing something out of them. I've said before sometimes in this gathering that a word from the Lord can get us through a whole season. But this passage has made me reflect on sometimes there's whole seasons where all God has given us is a question to wrestle with, a question. I just want you to know this morning that if you find yourself in that season, even on this Easter morning, where it feels like you don't have a word, but you just have questions, that maybe God is asking of you, I want you to know there's room for that in your discipleship. There's room for that in your walk with Jesus. There's room for that in your experience with him. But the questions cause something to happen that I think is so indicative about how Jesus works with us. And it's that it causes the disciples to begin to talk to him about their disappointment. So now they're not just talking to each other, but they're talking to him as well. Friends, I don't know if you've ever been in a season painful enough. I know some of you have, where your communication with God just drops off. Sometimes I'm sitting with someone, in a low moment or a painful moment, and I can just tell as the conversation goes on, they might even be telling me about the pain, but I can tell that at some point they stop talking to him about the pain. I think there's something about painful seasons that can cause that to happen. And those moments with people, I often see part of my role as just gently reestablishing connection between that person and God himself again, to begin to talk to him. And so the disciples begin to tell Jesus about their disappointment and all the things that happened and what they thought would happen and didn't. And Jesus listens, and then he responds. And that might be the case for us too, that as we sit with a question, that as we begin talking to him again, that Jesus might respond. In this passage, he does it with a word of rebuke. How foolish you are. Now that may seem harsh, but how many of you have had a friend who was brave enough when you were in wrong thinking to just say to you kind of firmly and strongly, hey, that's wrong. The way you're thinking is wrong, right? I can think of times that folks did that with me, and I'm kind of glad they didn't take a gentle approach. I'm kind of glad they just interrupted, my framework of thinking and somehow opened me up to believe that something else was possible. So Jesus does that, this word of rebuke. But then he gives them a word of reminding them that the Messiah had to suffer. That actually Jesus himself had predicted this, that all of these things had actually been said to them beforehand. And somehow when God begins to remind us of the things that he said, of what he predicted, I was saying at the beginning of this talk, it's not as if Jesus told us in this age that it would just be victory after victory after victory. He told us that this would be an age of suffering, that this would be an age of sometimes taking a step forward and then feeling like there's steps backward. That is what has been predicted all along. We forget it. But sometimes when God comes back to us and reminds us, there's actually a kind of comfort in it. That's right. He said that this is what was going to happen. It somehow reminds us of God's sovereignty in the midst of it all. And then he gives them this word of reinterpretation. I wish I could have heard this. I wish I could have heard Jesus begin with the prophets and Moses and go all the way through and point out to them how this entire story was about him. How everything pointed to him. How every promise, how every miracle pointed to him. How even though this looked like everything was going wrong and hope was lost, it actually was the story that was being told all along. We've been talking in our series in Exodus about finding ourselves and interpreting our pain and even our disappointments within the story that God has given to us. That's what Jesus is doing for them. He's not telling them their pain doesn't matter. He's just reinterpreting it. He's supplying new meaning within the story that all along was pointing to him. And in all of this, the rebuke and the reminding and the reinterpretation, there's an emphasis here on what Jesus has said and what has been written about him. And friends, if I can just remind us this Easter morning, we will never outgrow the need to return to what God has said. Amen? We will never become too sophisticated for that. We will never have it so down in our minds and hearts that we're not going to have to read it again. Guys, I find, just to tell you, I find that when I drift from the written word, because I think I know it, or I think I got it down, you know what starts to happen? The spirit of this age begins to supply meaning to my suffering, to what's happening in my community, to what's happening around me. It's like, guys, if we don't make ourselves available to the voice of God, there are other voices that will be glad to fill that void for us. And sometimes, I don't know if this has happened to you, like Adam and Eve in the garden, when the devil came to them in such a sneaky way and just twisted God's word. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but sometimes I think I have a verse down, and then I go and look it up, and I'm like, I remembered that wrong. I made that to be something that I wanted it to say, or I let that be something that the devil wants me to believe. We will never outgrow this need to return to what God has said and to believe his promises again. As Jesus does this with these disciples, their hearts begin to burn. And we'll say more about that in a second. And they welcome him in. They welcome him to have a meal with him. And guys, this might be true of our story too. Disorientation, hiddenness, maybe a question. Maybe we start talking with God about the pain again. Maybe he begins to reinterpret some things for us, and now something is coming alive in our hearts once again that maybe was dormant. We might not have words for it. It might still feel scary. It might feel like we're daring to believe again. But we know this, that we want to be with this person, even if we don't completely understand what's happening. And these disciples invite him in, and they begin to dare to hope again, even though they still can't fully see. I remember in our community in Pennsylvania, we had a man who was diagnosed with long-term cancer. I believe it had started in his hand. And it was a slow-moving cancer, but it was just devastating, as cancer is. And for many years, he was able to function with the disease. But it began to move faster and spread into other parts of his body. And when he was diagnosed, his 2 girls were young. But by the time it really started to threaten his life, they were teenagers. And guys, for a whole year, people from our community, from our network, from other churches that knew and loved this family would gather in the living room of this family. We would anoint Scott with oil, and we would lay hands on him, and we would pray for the impossible. We would pray for healing. By that point in our community, to be honest with you, we had seen God do some extraordinary things in healing. So at no point in those times, praying for him, did I feel like we were lacking in faith. I never felt like Scott was lacking in faith. If anyone believed, it was him. And we gathered once a week because that's how much he was asking for prayer. And as healing didn't come, those times sometimes would turn into us weeping together, with his family. But we were still believing that God would heal. And then came the day, when Scott passed. I've done a lot of funerals, and Easter has a way of reminding me of that. This day when we celebrate life, it takes me back sometimes to these moments, actually, where it felt like something was so wrong, where disappointment happened. And this one affected me, the funeral and tending to his family. Once we, did what was needed in the crisis of the moment to care for his family, I just realized that I needed to get away for a little bit. So I went to Atlanta to a friend's house, and he had a nice back porch with some woods, and I just sat there for the longest. But guys, this road to Emmaus process, when I look back on me sitting on that back porch, that's what was happening. It's like, Jesus, where were you? I thought you were going to show up. I thought that you were there. And then the reminder that maybe he was, but we just couldn't recognize it. And then talking to him. I just remember sitting on that back porch, and finally, I probably hadn't cried about the whole thing, but finally beginning to cry and just telling the Lord my disappointment, that all of this had happened. And I remember saying to the Lord, Lord, I need a prayer for healing, for our community. If we're going to keep praying for the sick, then I need you to show me how to pray, because I'm not feeling it from here. If this is what it's going to be like, I'm not feeling it. If we're going to have to tend to 2 teenage girls that don't have their dad anymore, I'm not feeling it, But the opening of communication, right, allows him to come in again. I remember sitting on that back porch, and all of a sudden, it just felt like something was burning in my heart again, right? And maybe we could pray again. That maybe hope was more real than what I thought, even though we were experiencing this disappointment. As the disciples are in this honest exchange with Jesus, of walking with him and having this meal with him, and Jesus breaks the bread, then their eyes are opened. Open to what? Maybe it's this, that on this Emmaus journey, despite all of the disappointment and pain and conversation with God and questions and all of these things, maybe God has the ability, maybe he knows how to work with us in both hiddenness and revelation to somehow cause our hearts to burn again, so that our eyes might be opened, so that we might align with God's reality once again. And what is that reality? Well, it's a reality according to Jesus that includes resurrection, right? Just think about this. If it were true that just one person rose from the dead, not even Jesus, but just one person rose from the dead in all of human history, that means that all of reality is changed forever, right? It means that no matter how hard or how bad or how impossible, anything might still be possible in these really difficult circumstances. And if resurrection is possible, then any number of lesser things might also be possible, right? And we might go through this life never seeing resurrection. We might go through this life experiencing so much pain and heartache and despair as some people do. And yet there is this protest built into the historic narrative that someone rose from the dead, right? Now, as it turns out, it wasn't just someone. It wasn't just the people in the Old Testament that rose from the dead, or the people, the children and adults that Jesus rose from the dead in the gospel narratives. It turns out that Jesus himself rose from the dead. That all of those resurrections that happened were pointing forward to this resurrection when God himself went into the grave and came up from it to defeat it once and for all. Amen? Guys, if that's true, it means that no matter what kind of day we had, or disappointment we're experiencing, or despair we're talking about with one another. And I think we should be honest about all of those things. I don't think resurrection means that we should hide our disappointment from one another. I think we ought to be able to talk about it with one another. And yet it means there is this protest that even though death might be a thing, and it is a thing, that resurrection is a thing too. A world with resurrection means a world of possibility beyond our imagination. Amen? Sometimes you guys are a little quiet. It's okay, though. It's all right. Guys, I don't know what you wrote. The worship team can begin to come back up. I don't know what you wrote on the chalkboard out there. I went and looked at some point, talking about where our hearts might burn again. I'm sure in a room like this, there's just different stories, different levels of pain. Maybe you're coming to this Easter with disappointment. That's just on the personal level. But think about the world that we live in. I don't know about you, but in these last few weeks, I found myself just as a parent again, wondering what kind of world my kids are going to inherit. There are these seasons where even though we believe Jesus is king and his kingdom is truly on the earth and his kingdom is in breaking, it does feel like empire is winning. And it feels like sometimes we're in a moment like that. It might be true for us as we look out on the landscape of pain and suffering and injustice. It may be true for you personally as you experience pain. But I think Jesus knows how to work with us so that our hearts begin to burn again. Now, he might do it in all these ways. He might hide himself. He might keep you from recognizing him. But it doesn't mean he's not there. He sure will walk with you. He may begin to ask you questions. You may begin to talk with him again. You may invite him in closer. And this thing called hope might show up in your soul again. I think this language of our hearts began to burn is an interesting metaphor. It's used throughout the scriptures, but it's used here because burning has the connotation of pain. And guys, that's true about hope. It hurts to hope again. It hurts to long again. I had a friend one time tell me that it's one of the hardest things to do is to believe, to pray again, especially after Scott died. One of the hardest things to do is to pray like God will show up, that he will interrupt the scene, that he will show himself to be who we sang him to be this morning. That's one of the hardest things. And that's why hope sometimes feels like a burning, feels like a pain. Because it's hard. But friends, I'm here to tell you that whatever Easter this is for me in the faith, whatever number this is, knowing Jesus. And some of you have experienced more than me, but I'm just telling you, as far as me, I still believe in this burden called hope. I still believe in this longing. I still believe in this burning. And the burning is painful, but the worst thing is for us to become numb. The worst thing is to let everything die when we live in a world with resurrection. My first funeral, and like I said, I tend to remember these around Easter, but my first funeral was for a child who died of complications of sickle cell. And that was like a quick baptism into pastoral care, into caring for a family. It was a family in our community. She had come to our day camp program. She was probably about 9 years old, probably the age of my youngest daughter when she passed. There was an older AME pastor in our community who really did most of the funeral, but he just took me under his wing. I learned so much from him by just watching him interact with the family. Me and that AME pastor were in the room when they disconnected life support. And that was my introduction, to doing funerals. And friends, the only reason I'm telling you this right now is to say that I get it. Death will make its boast. I get it. And you get it too, because you have your own stories. You have your own moments where it sounds like the boast of death is loud, and it feels like this thing that we believe in isn't working. But just because I saw a child die, which I did, doesn't mean that we don't live in a world where resurrection has happened. And if we live in such a world, it means that with every time we face sickness, every time we face death, we have the privilege not to surrender to despair, even if we experience it again. That we have the privilege to not let it define the narrative, even if we shed tears. That we have the privilege to protest, and that protest is called hope. That protest is called praying again. That protest is called serving again. That protest is called singing again. It means that we don't have to let that pain have the final word. So let me tell you another story. We were in a gathering in our community years after that child's funeral, and a kid in our community suddenly got violently sick, started throwing up over and over again. Like, we were all together hanging out at a picnic, and he started throwing up. It was so violent, the mom felt like I need to get him to the hospital. So she took him to Children's Hospital, and very quickly they diagnosed him with a pretty rare disease. And basically his body was just like rejecting anything, water, food that went into it. It was something wrong with the cells in his esophagus. The disease was so rare, only a couple hundred known cases in the world, that doctors were flying in to help with the family. And then the mom asked me to come and pray for the healing of her son. And friends, after you've done like the funeral of a child, you see what I'm saying? Like, that can affect the way we act and believe moving forward, right? And so as I'm driving to Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, I feel like I'm supposed to pray boldly. Like, not just do like a nice pastoral prayer, which I knew how to do, but that I'm supposed to pray boldly for this little boy. So I go into the hospital. I walk through the doors of Children's Hospital, and all the faith just gets sucked out of me, to be honest with you. There's sick kids everywhere. I just think, no, I know what this is. I was in this hospital once when a little girl died. So I know what this is. And see, there's the temptation to just begin living by the narrative that we think we have to. This narrative of despair and this narrative of suffering. And so I walked up, I talked with the mom and the little boy, and guys, I was just such a coward that day. I just prayed a pastoral prayer that I knew would, the mom would say thank you, and that I would get to leave, without really taking any risks, but that's what I did. And as soon as I got in the car, I just felt this conviction from the Lord. What I heard in my mind was, who do you think I am anyway? It was this word of rebuke. And guys, you can imagine the conversation. Well, Lord, I know who you are, but then this little girl died and we did her funeral. And who do you think I am? A word of rebuke. A word of reinterpretation, right? No, the story that we've inherited is a story of resurrection. And it means no matter how much we have to look death in the face, we don't have to surrender to it. It's our privilege, right? So I went home. I told Chelsea what a coward I was. And she said, well, it sounds like we need to go back to the hospital. And so Levi and Jade were really young. And so we made arrangements for them. And Chelsea came with me to the hospital because I'm braver with her. And a friend met us there. And I was so stupid stuff, cowardly stuff. I was so afraid of looking like a fool, of looking like a resurrection fool, of looking like someone who actually believed that resurrection is part of the history of the world. I was so afraid of looking that way that we put a sign on the door that said, no one come in here. I was like, if one person with an advanced degree walks into this hospital room, I'm going to feel so embarrassed, at this research hospital. and so we closed the door and we spoke to that sickness. And we said, you have to unhand this little boy. You have to let him go. In Jesus' name. You have to go. He's not going to be taken from our community. It's not going to be taken from us. Now, guys, I shared with you the first story because I want you to know I'm not sharing this with you in a cheap way this morning. I've done the funerals of children. So I'm not sharing some cheap thing. What I'm holding out to you is the reinterpretation of resurrection. And I don't know if every time we pray, someone's going to get better, or our communities are going to be made whole, or if that person that we're ministering to is going to be delivered, or if these impossible issues of injustice the empire throws at us are somehow going to be unraveled. Guys, I don't know. All I know is that this man, Jesus, was dead, and now he's alive. And that changes everything. And friends, the next morning, after looking like resurrection fools, I received a phone call from that mom. And they had done a biopsy of his cells, and the disease was gone. Now, I've experienced just enough of those stories for it to hurt real bad. You know what I mean? For a burning to start that can't go away, but can't always be resolved either. That's what it is for our hearts to burn, all right? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take communion together. You know, it's when Jesus broke the bread that their eyes were opened, and maybe that's some of the purpose of this meal and why it's appropriate for us to take it even on Easter. Because when we break the bread together, there's always the possibility that God might open our eyes for us to see that he's been here all along, for us to wrestle with the questions in our hearts. And then we're going to worship. Now, if you know me, you know, and this community is still getting to know me some. But guys, probably because of some of the pain in my life, we're all wired differently, so don't hear in this any I'm not putting expectations on you. Worship for me, young, became a lifeline for me to get through pain, right? And so people who know me know sometimes I can worship crazy. Sometimes I can pray crazy. But it's just because that was survival for me, young. Even though I can worship that way, here's something that might surprise you about me, is that I don't like it when worship is just sing-songs. When we're just singing and that's what we're supposed to do in church and then we go through it. What I want is worship as protest. is worship. I don't care if it's silent, loud, but worship that is like, here we are again, breaking bread again, lifting our hands again, declaring the promises again. And we get it. Death is a thing. We get it. Death will boast. But we know this too. We'll look like resurrection fools on Easter because the narrative we've inherited is that resurrection is possible. Amen?